Oh, I'm Andy Schmuckler, the host. Well, do have a guest today, so I am the host of this podcast or this live stream, which I like to call these days Seeing Things Whole. But it also could be called A Better Human Story, or it could be called Be the Heroes That We Need. Those are the nominees, and I'm not dealing much with it, but that gives you an idea of what this is about. Let me also give you an idea of what this is about before I introduce our return guest to talk about, well, let me show you what we're going to talk about. A secular way to connect with the spiritual dimension. An interview, my friend Forrest Jones has chosen this topic from among the various things that make up this integrative vision I've got about how we're supposed to understand our situation in the human world at this time when American democracy is in jeopardy, where the survival of human civilization itself is in jeopardy, a way of seeing things. But he's chosen that we're going to go into the spiritual dimension, and I'm delighted with that choice because, well, there's so much spirit and depth in it. But after this this opening segment, which will run for a goodly while, I have these other topics on my mind. My guess is I won't get to all of them, but I might. Why is human sexuality beset by complications? And another one is so many Palestinian dead because neither side cares about them. Another one on things topical, Hunter Biden's sacrificial role, and also topical and related to our immediate situation, Justice Alito's my way or the highway spirit. And then finally, the idea, not a happy one, but one that evidence shows that liberal immigration policies turn out to be damaging to the force of liberalism. And we may not like that truth, but if it's true, it's something we need to take into account. So, without further ado, I want to introduce my friend Forrest Jones. We're going to discuss a secular way to connect with the spiritual dimension. And Forrest, let me just hand it to you with my thanks for your being here to explore this with me, put me through my paces, or however the shape of this thing goes.
Great. Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you and have some fun on these topics. Hopefully, we'll have a rich discussion that people will enjoy. Today, as you said, we agreed to work on a topic called a secular way to connect with the spiritual dimension. So let's start by breaking it down and discuss what's the secular worldview and then your interpretation of the spiritual dimension. How do you define the secular worldview and explain the aspect that has abandoned the spiritual dimension?
Well, that's a great place to start. The secular worldview that I mean, a secular worldview means, all those people who are not using the prism of some established traditional religion that's been handed down to them, whether it be, through the Quran or the Bible or whatever. All those people who don't have that, you could say that their point of view is a secular one, but I have a more defined group, not just anybody who's just, people don't necessarily have a worldview. They just may, a lot of people probably just have a sort of chaotic, just set of perceptions, interests, putting it together is something that you either do for yourself or somebody else does it for you. And in a secular worldview, you don't have all those people doing it for you. And it's a job doing it for yourself. And but I've interacted with that world, from my education, going to, being involved with America's finest universities and interacting with people on my website that I had during the Bush years and up until I ran for Congress, which was where we met. So that worldview does not recognize that the spiritual dimension is real. It does not honor the spiritual dimension. It does not. It has a way of thinking that what's real is what's out there and what can be seen objectively. And the thing about the spiritual dimension is there's no way it could exist in an objective way. I mean, the nature of the thing has got to do with experience and perception. You have to have an experiencer and a perceiver and somebody who feels the way he or she feels in relation to the experience. So it essentially, by defining reality solely in objective terms, it defines into less than real everything that must be anchored in the experiential realm. So what
Well,
I try
it's
to do,
shared experience, though, right? I mean, it's not just experiential realm; it's what we can prove together and share together. I mean, the scientific method and objective truth is a great thing.
to experiences. That is the fact. And the secular worldview doesn't draw the necessary conclusions. So my work is about expanding the secular worldview, not getting rid of it. I say evidence and logic applied to through the evolutionary perspective tells us that this thing is real, that it's important, and that it's life-serving, and that's what the thinking, laying it out thing is for, and it's got to do with that we have certain things that are born into us. One of them, apparently, factually, is a capacity for spiritual experience. Whatever is born into us, almost, I mean, not without exception, but I mean, there's evolutionary theories about, Stephen Jay Gould and his Spangle, but basically, whatever is built into us through the blueprint that made it from our ancestors to us is there because it helped our ancestors to survive and get their DNA into the future. I mean, this is the secular worldview that's called Darwinism, which is an incredibly important insight into the way things have unfolded. And if something has been planted in us, we can assume that the people who were moving in the direction of having that were more capable of getting their DNA into the future than whoever among their contemporaries didn't, because that's how natural selection works. It's not random which ones succeed in getting their DNA into the future. That's how we get to be built in such an amazing way. That's the whole story about evolution. Is you start with some self-replicating animals, or entities. Not even a cell, at the beginning, and whatever self-replicates just becomes, whatever gets its DNA into future and on a non-random basis over 3.5 billion years leads to the biosphere that we see. And it also led to the creation of us with our various tendencies about how we will experience, each one of which can be inferred to have been in the service of life.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to define I like to add in my thinking the notion of musically gifted, as a comparison to spiritually prone, to experiencing the spiritual dimension. Some people have superior musical talent, unbelievable. They're just gifted from start with, perfect pitch and everything, and they do rhythms of all kinds. They
What's the
understand how it's
question
all
about
broken down. And then the question is, do you see this capacity for experiencing the spiritual dimension, for having that experience similarly? It's just a capacity that evolved over time.
Well, it's interesting you should raise that. I have a good friend who may actually be on here with me sometime soon to discuss evolution. We're talking about that. He and I have both wondered about the explanation of the role of music in our species. I mean, you're talking about the musically gifted. Yeah, people vary, and okay. But the thing is, that music is important to people everywhere. And I've done a little writing about why it is, but he and I share a sense of it being a little bit of a mystery. I mean, you can talk. I think that music brings people together. I mean, you can make a list of like you ask the question. Okay, you've got a hunting gathering society, and I think we can assume that at a certain point, well before civilization, there is singing and dancing around the fire or whatever it was, and different cultures would have done it differently. But I think we can assume. I mean, look at the role music plays in African tribal life, for example. This is real deep stuff. Why is it that the singers like Frank Sinatra and Elvis and the Beatles are the people that drove women crazy? What was going on in hunting gathering societies that had anything to do with that? So I think that there are potential answers about why singing and dancing would be a really big deal, and not entirely necessarily separate from what you and I are going to be talking about here, which is, what do you mean by the spiritual dimension? But music in the spiritual dimension, listen to Bach in some cathedral from his time. You can just imagine that when that organ was doing that and the choir was doing this cantata, that the people who were there to whatever you want to say, this Lutheran church, that they were getting deeper and deeper into the spiritual dimension because of the music and other things.
That uplifting experience, right? That yeah, they each had. So we've kind of broken down the secular worldview. Let's break down the spiritual dimension. How do you what do you use to think of when you want to? I mean, define the undefinable, right? The spiritual dimension.
Well, I mean, it isn't going to have a crystal clear, definition, like pi out to the nth degree, decimal point. But I think that we can get there satisfactorily when we're dealing with something which is sort of, what's the word? Ineffable. The spiritual dimension moves in the direction of like wow and awe. That's one aspect of it. So the idea that it blows your mind and therefore not going to be something you can just pin down in a narrow way. But this is how I see it. I believe that some kind of survey has shown that 1/3 or so of Americans report having had some experience in their life that, and then there's a question of exactly how do you finish that, and I'm not sure how it did, but it was sort of life-changing, maybe, or a sense of seeing things at a far more profound level of reality. that this is a kind of where it's at kind of thing, and maybe people will come back from it with some, oh, this is true, a spiritual truth that's sort of more passionately believed in. I mean, it takes a lot of different forms in different people's lives. I've had to see a sense of going deeper, of it being a special hyper reality, and that the things that in the normal consciousness are sort of value, the things that are seen in this dimension is when things are so valuable that we experience their having a sacredness about them, whatever, however you want to define that. Again, everything at this level is kind of ineffable, but people. So
Well,
what
that's the
I
word people use. You don't, yeah, it's a fine word.
yeah,
Sacred is really a good word, and it just
I,
means something, and it means like it blew them away. Like you said, it was, oh, wow, this is like realer than real.
And I think that if you went to the Sanskrit, there would be a word which wasn't exactly like sacred in the Western tradition, but was sort of pointing toward the same thing, and I think in the Taoist mystical tradition, I think Chuang Tzu was definitely coming from a place where he was in touch with something he probably had language for. That might, connect with, the sense of the sacred. Well, there are different senses of the sacred. In the biblical tradition, this poor innocent guy who, for all good intentions and good reasons, reaches up and touches the Ark of the Covenant so that it doesn't fall off the wagon or something like that. But I think he gets killed by it.
Don't know that story, but yes,
Yeah, I prefer a friendlier sacred than
yeah,
that.
I got
And
Noah's Ark for sure.
the guy was being a friend of the sacred. You don't kill him, geez. But that says something about the Chuang Tzu wouldn't have seen it that way.
No,
But yeah,
metaphorically, I would go with blew him away. Like you said, it's a wow factor that is
yeah.
beyond any other experience, and so it blew him away. And someone kept reading that and saying, "Well, what the hell happened to this guy?" And they said, "Well, he died."
Well, and another aspect of the spiritual dimension, in terms of the experience of the spiritual dimension, is those experiences tend to be very impactful. I probably already said that, and they can change the course of people's lives. Like for me, I had an experience which led to 14 years later to the publication of that book, The Parable of the Tribes, that you and I have talked about. But and then in 2004, I had another experience of something very dark, and it changed the course of my life then too. And I think that's not universal in every spiritual experience, but I think it is one of the characteristics. Is that Paul's on his way to Damascus? He gets struck by lightning, and and
Surely that's
all
the
of a sudden
classic, right?
he changes from Saul to Paul.
Changes from persecuting the Christians to
to,
championing their cause.
to being the guy who wrote most of the New Testament. Well, I don't know if it's most, but quite a few letters.
That's it. Well, that
Yeah.
is right, and that's so that helps us define. Okay, what are we saying when we say secular? What are we saying when we say the spiritual dimension?
Let, let me take it one step further. Let me just in a sentence. The point is that we've got that capacity, and the fact that we have that capacity tells us some very important things about the spiritual dimension, that it's life-serving.
And worthy of investigation, and worthy of complete maturing and fostering of that capacity to its highest
We can infer
extent, right?
that our ancestors had an advantageous impact on our ancestors, that because of their access to this spiritual dimension, whoever came back, whether it was the shaman or the collective or whatever, they came back and behaved differently in a way that made them our ancestors and not these other people who were not developing that capacity. So, whether it's music or our appreciation of beauty or our sense of some things as being or better or worse, and I deal with all of those. But this one thing, and maybe it's confined to the human species, this one thing we know, it's in the human genome because it's so universal. Maybe not 100% of people, like the musically gifted, maybe you got to be put together with an especially good dollop of this capacity to get there.
Well,
But
maybe a
1/3 of
series
people,
of genes
oh
that
yeah,
interact together.
well, I have no idea the way, what DNA actually does, but you can see what it does.
Right.
You and I are descendants from mitochondrial Eve, and we both got 2 eyes and a nose, and just generally are members of the same species. However that works.
Yeah, exactly. And then our
And we're a member of a
metaphor, our
species,
scientific explanation is DNA today, and we'll see
but
where we
it's
end up
something.
200 years from now. But yeah, it's the
Well,
right
at least
metaphor to use right now.
in my secular worldview, evolution is it's not just a theory. It is the key. It is
Hmm.
something I accept as, yeah, this is what's happened on this planet for the last 3.5 billion years.
Absolutely. And you do both, biological evolution, and you point out, hey, wait, we left biological evolution, and now we're trying to figure out societal evolution. We're trying to get societal
Yeah.
evolution peaked out to where we can survive, or we're going to create the destruction of ourselves.
And one of the reasons why it's important for people with a secular worldview to embrace the reality and importance of the spiritual dimension, like we need to tune in on this because it, at least for our ancestors in hunting gathering situations, at least for them, it was a source of guidance on a good path, which is why a good path, meaning they succeeded in surviving and passing their blueprint on into the future. That it's pro-life in a fundamental way. We can infer that. And so the secular worldview should incorporate the conclusion that we know that this is, at least in our ancestral past, a source of good guidance. So we should tune in on it, honor it, and be fortified by our spiritual passions, because the people who go through those experiences, it's so obvious that they're on fire in a way that the people who don't, who are skating along the top don't. When you find something sacred, you are inspired to serve it. And human survival is really in jeopardy right now. We need all the strength we can get.
All right. You're ahead of me on my questioning here. Let me look a second. And so I'm checking my boxes off. So why do we think the secular worldview lost respect for this aspect of the human experience?
Okay. Well, I
Because it was
don't.
like, I mean, I want to like think, like you said, what about when, Bach produced his work? He probably performed them in a church because that's where people gathered, because that's where you could find human beings to listen to you. He
And that's
went
how
to
he got.
church.
That's who gave him his paycheck too.
Yeah, that's right. That's where his
And
paycheck
his
came from.
whole
So
life
there
he
was a
was working.
whole world where it was like everyone was involved with a church somewhere, and mostly, if they weren't involved with the Catholic Church, they were persecuted. But, So we come from, my ancestry comes from that lineage, Asian cultures and
That
others.
was on the Lutheran side.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Excuse me for insulting.
No,
But
it's
the
just a
point
matter
being
of,
that, what do you think, caused the secular worldview, and I think it's part of Darwin's, gift, right? That the secular worldview lost respect for the human experience. And it isn't Darwin who caused that.
it isn't implied by Darwinism, which is my argument. It's in fact, it leads you to conclude on the contrary. But I think that I don't know if this is the heart of it. I tend to think that, but if you think about the role of science in Western civilization, starting with, well, let's go back at least as far as Galileo, that there's something rising, and on to Newton, and the when you think about Newton and the clockwork universe, I mean, there was a spiritual aspect, in a sense, to this scientific way of thinking. It was a very mechanical, dead thing. It just cranked. Um, but the scientific worldview was extremely successful in providing insight into the world that we live in. And it had a lot of prestige. And I think a large component of the secular worldview sort of embraced an understanding. I would say it should be regarded as a misunderstanding of science, because science, it's a misunderstanding if you think that only things that are out there are really real, and that you can dismiss things like value judgments as merely subjective and a matter of opinion. And when I say I've interacted with the liberal world, I did a radio show on Wisconsin public radio on the subject of judgment, and I've seen how people of a liberal secular way of thinking will say, oh, they're not willing to make any judgment, because judgments are just matters of opinion. The only thing that you're willing to judge is judgmentalism. And I've had students, both in the 1970s and in the aughts of this millennium, who would say things to me like, what the Nazis did. I'd ask something like, well, was what the Nazis did at Auschwitz wrong? I mean, if you can't get a yes to that one, there is no such, nothing. So I've had two students who basically said, what the Nazis did at Auschwitz is not something I would have done, but it seemed right to them, and so it was right for them. It's moral relativism, because it's just a matter of opinion. From us, I
Do you think the roots of that moral relativism is just their, pathetic, egocentric, self-serving thinking, or do you think that they really were drawn to something more profound philosophically that they?
something in the culture which has been dismissive. I think of there was a whole philosophical movement called logical positivism that emerged in the heart of the European culture, like in the 1920s, particularly in Vienna. But it was a very powerful movement, which the waves of which were still washing up on me in the 1960s. That basically what the logical positivists said was that statements of value are essentially meaningless. I mean, they're very explicit. They worked out something which was already in the culture, that dismissed the experiential, subjective realm. It regarded the subjective as merely subjective, and what I'm doing is saying, yeah, there's plenty of that, but we are born with experiential tendencies. Those tendencies are the product of evolution, and they're important, and they're clues to the reality of things. I mean, the
Well,
question of value.
you're
Go
using
ahead.
tendency there. You used capacity a minute ago. I
Oh,
mean,
you're right.
it's
In the case of the spiritual, I do see it as a capacity. I mean, we have experiential tendencies that that other mammals also have, and who know, that we find some things better and some things worse. A positive that we go for, and a negative that we try to avoid. It's in there for a reason. You can see why it would be there. We're
sure.
motivated to do the things that feel good. It turns out that a lot of them are good ways of getting your DNA into the future, like eating, drinking, making love. Yeah. You want the creature to be motivated to taking care of business.
But
But
the back to the why the secular worldview abandoned. It's considering spiritual world, the spiritual dimension real. The the point you were making was this emergent philosophical thing in academia. I guess you're saying that was trying to figure out something, and I assume that its motivation was about, hey, wait a minute, we've got to fight this moral exclusivity by creating a more inclusivity that has no morals or something to that effect.
here's another dimension of it. Well, first of all, I don't claim that I understand, that whole
That movement,
transition.
right?
Yeah, but another part of it is that there are dimensions of the human world that are very important. The moral dimension is very important. The spiritual dimension. I mean, if you read the Bible or you read the Bhagavad Gita or you read the literature of Taoism or any of these other things, you can see that these are very important. And they are means of delivering into people's minds that the spiritual is real and important. I mean, you can't read the Bible without thinking that. Uh, that the moral is very important. Are you going to feed the widows and the orphans, or you rich people? Oh, 10 Commandments. It is very, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, it's right there, and everybody who gets their worldview from that gets it delivered from from the time they first start hearing biblical stories about Adam and Eve and not resisting temptation and all that stuff. You know, it's there. Now, let's say you stop feeding your mind off of that or taking your worldview off of that. How are you going to get to the moral and the spiritual dimension? I don't think it's an easy thing to do. I mean, I say that I can show a force of evil. Okay, I mean that's a separate thing, but the people in a religious perspective had never have a, Satan was there in the second chapter in Genesis, tempting Eve. Uh, the evil is there from easily conceived. Well, how do you if you don't get the supernatural embodiment of that? How do you get there? And I can see why people didn't get there. It takes some steps, But the spiritual, how do you get there? And when you look and you see that people really do have different experiences. I mean, for example, Bertrand Russell wrote an essay which I found rather elegant when I was in my teens, where he basically lays out all these different religions that claim that they've got the truth and draws the obvious logical inference that if this one is true, then that means all the rest of them are false. And yet every one of them has their completely convinced adherents. And why is there any reason to, believe even that first one, uh, that is sort of, I think that when people stopped holding on to an orthodoxy, then they would have to think about, well, in what way could there be spiritual truths given what Bertrand Russell pointed out, that people have come back and the societies have collected their spiritual truths, and they aren't all saying exactly the same thing. I mean, in some ways, there are contradictions between them, and in some ways, they may be saying the same thing in different ways. But I think that when you let go of an orthodoxy, it's sort of, it takes some doing to come up with an understanding which allows one to learn what one can, where one can, and recognize that we're not going to get a complete truth. You know, a certain amount of humility is required that isn't required if you go through the catechism of some religion.
Right.
You know,
And
I
if you
think there are a
touch
lot
that
of
whole
challenges.
truth, you know, like you reach up and you touch the Ark of the Covenant, you know, it's just too big of a realization. It'll blow you away.
I mean, if the best of the Taoists and the best of the Hindus and the best of the Catholics and the best of the Pentecostals and the best of the the Muslims. If what is it? What can we infer if we believe that they tapped into something? All of them.
Right.
What does that tell us about the nature of spiritual truth? And I think it tells us, you know, human beings aren't going to necessarily get the whole thing, but that's not doesn't mean that you can't know that there's a path there to follow. You know, as best you can to where you can get to.
Absolutely. Let's talk about what you were doing, what you think maybe influenced, what you think maybe brought about the spiritual connection that overwhelmed you, that made you create the parable of the tribes over the next 14 years. Like, what were you, have you looked at that and said to yourself, well, I think maybe because I was pondering X, Y, Z?
It's a real story there. It is sort of the cockpit of my life, actually. I didn't know that I was going to end up with something like this.
Right.
There was a crisis in my life for 2 years leading up to it, and that this resolved. Do you want me to tell the story? Should I?
Yeah.
Well, there were some personal things going on, like my dad died in October of 1967, and I cannot overstate how profound a blow that was to me at the age of 21. And also, I had been engaged to be married, and that relationship broke up. And also, I was in a new city without friends, Chicago, at the University of Chicago, social thought and clinical psychology, a joint doctoral program. It was not an easy time for me.
Three of the
I,
top, 5 stressors that can happen to a human being.
yeah, and but there was stuff happening at a much larger level that I was just one of a whole generation getting swept up into. First of all, the war in Vietnam. I had come to understand what I still understand about that war. That we, in by the end of '67, I already knew that this was a wrong thing to be doing. It was going to do great damage to our country, to the Vietnamese, and to the world order for us to continue to pursue this thing. So I was hurting from that. And then I got my draft notice in January of 1968, report, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where we're going to induct you into the Army. Now, I had been a patriotic American boy who always felt like if I had to be storming the beaches of Normandy, well, I would have done my patriotic duty and done it creditably. I'm not sure how true that is. I feel kind of scared of it now. But
Didn't get to test it then.
yeah, I didn't get the 10, but that was the war that my father's generation got. I got this crappy war that we shouldn't even be fighting. I already knew. So that was a stressor. And then there were the assassinations of on April 4th of Martin Luther King, on June 4th, I think it was, right after midnight, Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated after he wins the California primary in the contest between the two candidates who are running to stop the war in Vietnam. And then there's the Chicago Convention, which was like traumatic, like really traumatic for me, because I had given myself heart and soul to trying to lead to the Democratic Party choosing something better than what LBJ had been giving us, which was a war that was going to only keep destroying and not build anything. And then there was the Prague Spring, where the communist regime in Czechoslovakia was. Am I telling you too much? Is this?
No, I'm feeling it.
Okay.
I'm feeling that whole pressure cooker. It's
Okay.
pretty intense.
I mean, the idea that the Czech people would be reaching out for freedom in this Prague Spring, a fellow named Dubček and all that. And we had watched in '56 how the Soviets had just crushed with their tanks the aspirations of the Hungarian people, and something similar in Poland, but not to the same extent. What was going to happen here in '68? Well, the tanks rolled in. And once again, the Soviets had crushed the human spirit, killed the Prague Spring. So I had, up to that point, I turned 22 in April of '68. I had lived in the world as sort of I don't know about a charmed life, but just going from success to success. Everything was working well for me. I got to pursue my passions for learning and understanding, and I was going to get a career, and I was going to fit into I write my books, and it was all laid out for me. And all of a sudden, the world seemed so out of joint, whether the personal stuff or the global stuff or how the two were. I was just sort of breaking apart. And the world looked to me like it was just so much less benign. There was so much more destructiveness in it than I had realized living in, in a decent family and a decent community, getting a good education. I had two questions that are, why is the world like this? I mean, really, I did not understand what I had discovered. And not understanding the world was not consistent with my whole trip in life. Everything I was doing was about understanding some meaningful piece of the world. And the other thing was, what am I going to do with my life? If the world's out of joint, my plans to just sort of fit into the world, I'd be out of joint too. I mean, what does it make sense to do if the world's like this? So I didn't necessarily know how to go after those questions, but I pursued them as best I could. Turn on, tune in, drop out. I became a dropout for the first time, made a living doing a variety of things. I was an intern psychotherapist. That didn't really scratch the itch. I loaded trucks in Oakland when the Teamsters didn't have a man on hand. But I really was lost. I got a letter from my grandmother saying, "Dear Andy," she was an immigrant, "Dear Andy, I hope you're becoming accustomed to your way of life."
Oh my.
It was her way of saying, what kind of fool are you that you're throwing away everything you've achieved and becoming a dropout when she had all these ambitions that she never was able to realize. You know, a very brilliant woman who never could make anything of herself because she'd had to flee the old country. And I hate the fact that she died without seeing that I returned to the path. And what I saw on that day in 1970 is what got me to the path. It was an answer to the question, why is the world so destructive? And it's still a pretty good answer, I think, 54 years later. And as for a job, it was obvious what the job was. Develop the idea, articulate it as best I could, get it out into the world where people can see that this is the way things are. And it has important ramifications for what is it we got to do.
So you did a great setup of the pressure cooker. And other people who've had spiritual experiences do have, it is in the depths of despair that they have a
Rock bottom.
breakthrough. They are completely, lost, and they have an opening, and an encouraging message comes through that helps them find their footing and see a new path and head down that path. That's a really, you just described that in such a way that you didn't even recognize the way you were saying it to me. You didn't even seem to recognize that you were just reciting classic, this is how the pressure cooker works for a human being. And it doesn't always have to be that way, but this is, like how some folk end up with, mystical experiences that then change their lives.
In the Testament, something to be reborn.
One must be born of the spirit after being born of the flesh.
First.
Say again?
I think the New Testament makes your point that one of the ways to the spiritual, that it often requires that somehow you get that the self that you came into the in with, it was too protective. It was it needed to get broken apart by suffering or trauma or something that you basically then have a motive to recover from, and maybe you can build something bigger and better than what you had before.
Right.
And that's how I feel about this.
But you just, all right, what I was going to say though is you did all that great setup of what the pressure cooker was, and then you don't take the moment of the vision and try to like expand on how that moment, which a lot of people can, I don't know about a lot of people, some mystics can, take it apart to where they can talk about it for an hour about something that lasted 25 seconds.
Well, I don't have that much, but if you'd like, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I have several books, each of which is the expression of a vision. But this one in particular, I had a moment. It was in Golden Gate Park. I had just been into the Japanese garden, seeing this incredible beauty of what it's an art form. The bonsais in the Japanese gardens is an art form that moves me. And I was sitting outside of that on a bench and sort of taking in simultaneously the beauty of that nature creates. Though in this case, a garden is sort of a
gardener, right?
But I wasn't thinking of it that way at the time. It was a good long while later, and I realized that wasn't just the forest. That was a garden. But the forest is a trip too. So, but anyway, and I'm nearby. There's sort of bumper to bumper traffic,
right?
And I'm getting exhaust and stuff like that, and hearing the sounds of motors and being sort of tuned in on them as a sort of a toxic sound and smell. And I saw little family um, walking over on the distance, and it was an interesting family. You could see they were all cut from the same cloth. I mean, the red hair and the pink skin on the father and all the children. I don't remember if the wife was that way or not, but I saw them as a sort of a little primate group that was moving along the landscape. And already I'm going sort of down deeper into the meaningfulness of things that one sees all the time. You know, you see the beauties of nature all the time. You see the sort of ugliness of, like a commercial strip uh, all the time. And you see sort of the organic nature of our existence in this family, where the father's DNA, has been passed along to the children, and they are moving across the earth, like their ancestors. Oh, I'm thinking, like, well, how did all that? And all of a sudden, and this is the part that I can't explain in my secular worldview. I'm still stuck on certain things that, I feel like I was being shown something. This idea, the root of it, the
It
heart of it,
intruded upon your consciousness.
it didn't feel like that, but I felt like voila, and I don't know where the voila was coming from, but I was shown, and the image of it made tangible. I'm not real wild about it, but I remember it was there. It's got to do with water and the California aqueduct. It was about sort of the sacred source from which the water flowed. Oh, it's not such a bad image after all. This, and yet the way it gets channeled is determined by the California aqueduct. The course it takes. Wow, it really does work. I mean, that is the idea. That the human spirit and human life form unleashed something that constructed a California aqueduct because of the dynamics of what it means to step onto the path of civilization and unleash a force. It's not a function of the creature's nature, but it's inevitable. So anyway, I mean, a lot of this stuff is, like after 50 some years of thinking about this stuff. But at that moment, it was like, this is the answer to the question why the world is filled with destructiveness. And I don't remember exactly how much there was. I mean, there's an idea that I lay out in writing again and again and again that basically is compelling. Did I see all that at that moment? How could I have seen all that at that moment?
Well, in telling of the story, I mean, I feel all the pressures of, you are just here you are, this like innocent kid, raised in this lovely environment, nurtured by, grandparents and parents, happy, looking at the future with bright dreams and everything, and then looking at a bunch of ugliness and not knowing how to fit in. And I can just feel that whole pressure, and then the loss of your father, the having to move, all these other traumas that just triggered like the nervous system to, touch that Ark of the Covenant and get blown away. Just returning to a metaphor, but I feel all that when you say that, and I can see, like the metaphor of the aqueduct. It's like, here's this, water is the start of it all, right? Without water, there wouldn't have been anything. Water and sunlight created everything.
It's something that flows. I think is the heart of the image.
Yep, and it's perpetual. In this case, a river that never stops flowing. It's the source of spirit is often, metaphorically water flowing because it just comes out of the ground and just, somehow magically appears and saves lives. But moving right along, I can definitely feel the why you realized, well, wait a minute, that's civilization, you know, channeling the water, and it's channeling my humanity. It's now like holding me in. It's putting pressures on me that I don't like and I don't understand, and it's messing with my human nature. It's making me conform. I can feel all that in that story, which is in
Yeah.
your writing.
As an
It's
adolescent,
good and bad. I mean, I think the channeling of the water produced, the aqueducts of Rome. Everyone did aqueducts. It wasn't the California aqueduct was the first one, but I'm saying, it's like the channeling of water is life-serving and was a good engineering idea, and in its essence harmless. But
what my idea is that when we left the order, the niche in which we evolved biologically, we created a new situation that
well,
has a
that's what
systemic
I
dynamic
can
to
see
it.
why that like just popped for you.
And-
That's the leaving of the order. That's the difference. You're sitting there at the garden, which you didn't recognize was created by a human being, thought of it as, nature all by itself, which is, and its most resplendent beauty, which nature can do that. But, if you look at West Virginia, it doesn't tend to do that.
well,
It
the
just gives you a
spiritual,
rugged landscape that's kind of messy and full of all kinds of stuff.
one of the consequences of this insight, and again, I don't remember. Um, Let me turn this off so it stops. Is that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. I mean, that follows logically from what I feel I can show. And though I can't understand what, so the spiritual thing is I'm being shown something like that I've never been able to come to terms with that exactly. But that was definitely the real fact of how I experienced it.
It happened to you. You
Yeah,
can never go away from that happened to you. It's
right,
real.
whatever that was, and then the implications of it were also spiritual. First of all, to see into the heart of this whole story of life on Earth is like you can see a big picture by lying on your back on the rim of the Grand Canyon and seeing all these myriad stars shining and all just grokking that you're living in this really big place. That can blow you away. Just like the astronaut got blown away by seeing the blue marbles. What you see can. So I saw this thing, and it showed that, well, we've been the victims of our own greatest gifts. We're like the tragic hero, that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. Uh, and then as I continue to work on it, there a lot of other things have followed over the years that are sort of like buried in the original formula, and you can derive them from it. So it's been a real spiritual adventure that we're really engaged in a very big drama. And that can blow you away just on its own. Like when we go to vote in November, we are also members of the civilization creating species who are enacting one of the showdowns that inevitably arose as soon as we stepped onto the path of civilization between two coherent forces. And this is our version of it right now. And when you see that, even these things that you just look at on the headlines are part of a very big picture.
Yes,
And that's a spiritual experience.
being able to capture the experience more broadly as the spiritual experience is what you're saying. To be
I
able
think that,
to feel all its connections and to realize its impacts.
I think there are a lot of different dimensions of what spiritual can be, but seeing things whole is one of the motifs that runs through the spiritual traditions, and I think characterize at least a lot of people's spiritual experiences to to make a lot of connections and to not just see things but things make sense when you see the big picture. And things making sense is part of what a spiritual experience tends to give. So that's what's going on. So it's just one, I don't know how many dimensions there are, but seeing things whole matters for the spiritual dimension. It seems that certain kinds of understanding trigger a kind of experience that take people into that deeper place where they get activated and impacted in a way that might change what they do in the world.
Certainly did that for you.
Yeah, on several different
It gave
occasions.
you guidance, and you were definitely looking for it. And
And my guess is that everybody has access to something.
everyone who's had any spiritual experience always walks away saying everybody could have this experience.
Yeah, I
It
don't
isn't
know if
true that
everybody could,
everybody has that experience, but everyone who's had one swears everybody else could have one.
is that true?
Well, except for the rare guru who's sure that he's achieved something that no one else could ever possibly achieve, and that
Well,
person's usually, like only famous for a little while.
I've only claimed that, like 1/3 of people apparently have had it, so at least that much. And I've wondered about whether with the other 2/3, it's simply a capacity that has never been triggered. Is that your understanding? Is that your belief that that is the case, that everybody has it in them?
I think your theory helps define why it's not alive and well in some others, in that they are burdened by the traumas of the lineage and can't get past the traumas of the lineage because of all the brokenness that befell their family and their cultural history, and that blocks them
Sure.
from seeing clearly the spirit that's waiting to support them.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I always often say that brokenness begets brokenness, and I think that it is true that people often have to heal. Um, Another route to the spiritual, besides like hitting rock bottom, what we were talking about. I think people sometimes have to be made more whole before they can have the spiritual experience. Um, and like love can heal people and
Be,
make them put them on a path to more spiritual depth.
being in the did you see the movie Elvis?
No, I haven't.
All right, doesn't matter then. But being in the presence of other people who are in the spirit, who are experiencing the ecstasy of the spirit, it makes it easier for any one person to, allow that within themselves. It's a cultural conditioning that you can tap into when you're in a culture that has gone as far as they can go into experiencing the spirit. That's my
Mm.
And it was illustrated in that movie in the beginning, like, Elvis goes to this black spiritual sing along, and is, overwhelmed. They do a great job with the dramatization, but that's why I asked if you saw it.
So that music transports and transforms him.
Yeah, well, they call it the spiritual, right? I mean, the music, the hymns that were, used for religious revivals and such like that, they are conducive to putting the nervous system in the right space to where it can open up to the sacred, and to open up
Let,
to the spiritual dimension.
I'd like to tell a little story that goes back to the music issue, because with Elvis, you've brought it back to me. I went to a wedding this past weekend. It was really quite an extraordinary wedding. And after, one thing that made an impression on me was the dancing afterward. It's mostly a younger crowd, and uh, the I watched these people get transformed in a way from the people who had been sitting at the wedding by the music, and they're dancing to it. And Sweet Caroline. And then
It's
this whole group that had met, that were strangers to each other, were suddenly that sweet Caroline, and they go da da da, like they've been rehearsing it on Broadway for a month, and they know all the lyrics, and they're all into this, and they're moving to it, and the faces are sort of illuminated, and I thought, why am I trying to convey this? Well, because that's what I got. I would have done a lot better to have written a
written
song.
songs. Yeah, written songs. That's right.
I mean, some of this stuff, I feel like it opens up to seeing something that is seeing things whole, that has spiritual implications on a long-term basis. But it isn't going to put you in the place where those dancers were. And here I am trying to convey, hey, I've got this integrative vision. Oh, yeah, well, there's this song over here. Da, da,
That's
da.
right. Neil
That's
Diamond.
more
Well,
who.
I mean, and then Taylor Swift's out making another $1 billion this year with her collection of songs that have touched so many people, and people gather in stadiums together and sing them together. I've read several articles about how powerful that has been for people that do it and what it means to them. I look at Taylor. I don't know a lot of her songs at all. I probably read the lyrics to three of them, and she has, she had she had an entire album on the top 10 list, or not, I mean, in the top 100, an entire album in the top 100 for, many, many weeks. This is how well known, popular, and impactful on a body of humanity she is. But psychologists have, analyzed the phenomenon and written about it, scholars
So
from
what's
Harvard and
your
scholars from
understanding of
Berkeley.
so what's going on between Taylor Swift and the Swifties? I mean,
Well, I
I
mean,
really
she's in touch with the dilemmas that they're going through in their modern lives, unfolding, and she's unfolding year after year with them. And they are going through, like, yeah, it does sound like that. And they love singing the songs. And then it's love and pain and relationship and it's all kinds of dramas about dealing with people and dealing with life. I mean, and it's it's pop music that's gotten rhythm and stuff that makes it easy to dance to and stuff. I don't know more, but I do know immensely more influential than Parable of the Tribes was.
yeah. Well, what I want to say about my kind of contribution is that we have, in addition to our sort of gut level organismic emotional uh, desires to feel alive and good
Yeah, yeah,
on a moment to moment basis.
and
Da,
with
da,
others,
da.
with
What?
others, right?
With others,
With
yeah,
with a shared experience. It's that
yeah.
shared, like, we know we are together.
What I'm trying to deal with my offering is that in the big picture, which is bigger than the the bioenergies of a dancer, we're in a place where our civilization is out of control. It's always been out of control, and we now have come to a point where it is visible that the outcome of this experiment that life's been conducting with our species about a civilized creature might end up with our getting our act together and surviving for the long haul on this planet. Or it may end up within the not so terribly distant future with our destroying ourselves. And so, even though it's not as elemental feeling as feeling, great on the dance floor, with which I concede I cannot compete at all. Nonetheless, we got a job to do because we're part of a species that's done this thing for the last 10,000 years that turns out to be very risky for us and for everything that's alive around us. And we got a job to do. And the best way to do that job is to understand what the damn job is, what we're up against. And that's the title of that book, What We're Up Against. So people will not be having these great times in the world. I doubt that there are events like that in Putin's Russia. I mean, this was
No. That would be
this.
too many
There
people
was
gathering and worshiping someone other than Vladimir Putin.
there is a beauty of spirit in that group that I don't fully understand. But it was an extraordinary experience for me. It was an almost perfect wedding, and there was a freedom of spirit in that group. Not that I made such wonderful contact with everybody who was there, 120 people. I kind of got it on with a few strangers, but it's not easy. But it was there, and if for example this coming election goes poorly in terms of the survival of human democracy, I mean American democracy, or then America is not going to be a place where that kind of thing is likely to happen. The human spirit's going to get injured, just like we were talking about all those people that have the capacity, you say, to have transformative spiritual experience. You say everybody's got it, but some people are too broken to get there. Well, if things go wrong at this particular juncture, and there are lots of junctures, uh, people will get more broken,
More
and
broken.
more people will be closed off from an experience of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the sacred. So there's a need to see the big picture. Otherwise, why would you even care if this explains why civilization has evolved the way it has, which is what I claim to do in that book, and which shines a light on the central drama that emerges as a systemic dynamic that the secular worldview needs to incorporate into its understanding of what our situation is and what we got to do about it.
Trying to tie back into music, I think of the Battle Hymn of the Republic and other, there are battle songs. There are things that the soldiers want to sing, and the soldiers, get uplifted by and strengthened by, and
There's a rhythm to the military music, and it's a
it's got to
rhythm
be
that's been
basic because
beautiful.
nobody's really musically talented. So it's got to be a real simple ditty,
Yeah.
but
Well, I love the movies, and I love moments like that. Like, there's a scene in Yankee Doodle Dandy where American boys are marching off to World War I, and they're singing George M. Cohan's song "Over There, Over There," and anyway,
yeah, but but that's the it's used. I'm just saying the military teaches it. Boy Scouts teach it. You use song, to get people to feel joined and on purpose to accomplish the goal ahead of them, regardless of whatever is their fate. And these songs have got to have stories of, well, it might be hard, but, we're going to triumph.
I think that there's some evidence. Maybe this is your brain on music. I read about it 20 years ago. I think there's evidence that when people sing together, there are a lot of synchronies that form. A lot of human interaction involves people synchronizing their heartbeats or breaths or steps, or there is a melding together. And you can definitely imagine how, if you're a hunting-gatherer species that survived the way they did in the world that they had to survive in, that the ability to bond together in such a way at the level of body and spirit was really important. That it would reinforce their having capacities that are conducive to survival.
and that used, something beyond, language and thinking to connect each other and connect to each other and help move together.
So the secular worldview has, I think, not understood very well what's been going on in the world around us in these years. As you know, I think, I've spent 20 years trying to point to something that has arisen, for example, in America, and now I'm trying to understand why it's also a global phenomenon. And the secular worldview, as it exists, that thinks that the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension can be dismissed as merely subjective and matters of opinion and stuff, was unable to perceive something that was arising, becoming coherent. I mean, there's been a lot of brokenness in our world all along. But what I've been observing for the last 30 years is how that brokenness has been feeding on itself and coming together as a coherent force in a way that wasn't true of the America that I grew up in. All, like white racism and corporate greed, just to name two rivers of brokenness in America, made alignment over the course of the last 30 couple years, and and together became more powerful. And the secular worldview didn't have a way of conceiving of such a coherent force, and they didn't see that there was a spiritual component to what it was manifesting. The fact that everything it was saying and doing was making the human world worse was a spiritually meaningful thing to observe, but you have to see the thing whole to observe that a pattern is emerging here. And that there is as if a spirit was taking over a large part of the nation and resulting in a lot of coherent behaviors that were having similarly destructive effects on the overall nature of our society and our interactions, our politics, our culture, how different groups of people feel about this relationship between the races, in terms of gaps of inequality, in terms of our behaving responsibly in relation to the climate crisis, and on and on and on, and honoring the rights of others, like to vote. It's a consistent pattern. You then have to say, well, the spiritual dimension can include, for example, perceiving that sometimes things come together as if a spirit is taking over part of the world. Oh, you can see that happening in Germany, late 20s and through the 30s. You can see that there was like a spirit that was taking possession of a people. If you look at how did this happen?
I don't want to call it a spirit, and I want to understand. I like that it's the brokenness being transmitted. That it isn't necessarily. How do I want to say this? Like I've never heard anyone have a spiritual revelation that when they talked about it, it ended up being other than life-serving and unifying and holistic. You know what I mean?
Let me
It's
give you one.
always like that. So what's this? And I always loved your work in that, well, the reason people don't get that, and it isn't a spirit, it's that the brokenness is looking for company. The brokenness is looking for, retribution is what our current, leader here is looking for. And that creates a camaraderie, not necessarily, and then people just go along to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And so it's something bigger than yourselves, like the spiritual domain, but it is not the spiritual domain. How about that?
Well, you want to confine the spirit to the positive, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure where I'm going to be about that, but let me just say that on first blush, it ain't necessarily so. That there was something happening, like when Hitler stood at that podium at Nuremberg, and these thousands of people in uniform and with their Sikh Heils and their torches and all that. There was something happening that kindled them at a level.
Well, it's an identity with nationalism, right? It was an identity of we are the people. I mean, this is the whole, a lot of
I think
religions go astray because they think they are the people.
the way I would put it is that there is a level of experience, and people are broken, and there are people who are broken to such an extent that even the things that might have led them in a direction of the good get transmuted by the brokenness into something else. Now, I've got on my list of things that I want to discuss today Justice Alito's My Way or the Highway Spirit. Now, I think, whoops, I want us to be, there we go. I think that Justice Alito shows that he has a spirit. He keeps reminding me of the Grand Inquisitor. Not this, I'm not talking about Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in that story in Karamazov. I'm talking about the actual Spanish Inquisition that tortured people and executed people, and My Way or the Highway, of the rise of Protestantism, the Catholic Church responding.
So these are the ways of power manifested to their nth degree, aren't they?
They are plugged into the spirit, it appears to me. I think that Justice Alito, if you read his Dobbs decision, there is a spirit that's shown. It's contemptuous, it's lacking in compassion. It entitles itself to impose its will on other people. It has no respect for the rights of other people to think differently. We've seen that through history. But I wouldn't deny that his passion is a religious passion. I just think that his attachment to some religious truths, like I think that believing that one shouldn't, that abortion is not an okay thing to happen, I think that's a defensible position. Imposing that position on everybody in America is not defensible. That's my position on it. I think both sides can make a plausible human case for coming down on one side or another. I don't fault people who say, if I were in that situation, I would want to have the child because I consider that child already sacred. But the spirit of I am going to impose my will on everybody else has taken over the Spanish Inquisition and the torturing of people, and Justice Alito and his Dobbs decision. So people are so broken. Some people are so broken, and we're getting a sense of just how much brokenness there is in that Alito family. The part that surprises me, actually, I've been thinking about this, is I would have thought that a guy like him would at least have felt like he would be extreme rectitude and follow all the rules and just really, really scrupulous. I would think he would have required that of himself, but he didn't. He's willing to piss on the rules for himself. And so I'm trying to figure out how does he combine that with the self-righteousness that he's got. I haven't figured that out.
It's a nice flavor of the brokenness, but it's just one flavor.
But but if the guy would, I would think, would have to sort of reconcile those. You know, a lot of people who are extremely dictatorial are nonetheless themselves punctilious, if that's the right word. That
You're
they're
beyond my
scrupulous. They're,
vocabulary, so yeah.
they're scrupulous in their own dealings, and they insist everybody else stick to their straight and narrow too. I mean, that seems more familiar to me than a guy that that combines his thumbing his nose at the same time as he's self-righteously saying to this reporter, you know, the important thing is that we win because there's no splitting the difference. And he's a
Yeah, yeah.
judge.
Well, but yeah.
Yeah, there's
The
no splitting the difference, meaning all the rights are on my side and none on their side. That's not like a judge.
not at all. And then I still, I'm just pushing back on the idea of using spirit. I think it's just, you're saying, oh, I can barely believe that brokenness is that broken, but it's standing right in front of you. You have to say that, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
exactly what's so. It's exactly what's
You
seeable.
know what it's
I mean,
called, the spirit.
that's the beauty of the. We don't have to say the devil is possessing him or influencing him or even that God hardened his heart. We don't have to say any of those things because your point is we've been, because society has created these pressures on the human beings, they're trying to conform, they're trying to figure out their way, they're using manipulative, behaviors in ways that help them master the ways of power. And he's just gotten this far, and he's just an example of how far it's gotten. I mean,
Well,
that's how I unpack your teaching.
let me say something about the spirit. I'm willing to let go of the idea that there's spirit there in that, but an evil spirit in the square in Nuremberg when Hitler and those people were in their state of practical ecstasy. Um, I'm willing to let go of the Spanish Inquisition being a manifestation of spirit, if you like. But when I had that revelatory experience, I was very interested in sort of like, what is the epistemological value of what I saw? You know, I looked and I realized that I wasn't the only person that had had revelatory experiences, and I was very interested to see what all other people had seen when they had, they didn't see that idea, they had seen other stuff, and I came to believe that all of us are human vessels um, with imperfections. And what gets poured into us might be completely pure. But by the time we express it or articulate it to ourselves, or I guess in the opposite order, first try to understand, well, what is this that I'm seeing or experiencing or feeling? It will be contaminated. It'll be both the pure stuff that we've got this place in us to tune into where the water flows out. And we are these contaminated vessels that can see as best we can and express it the best we can, but we are flawed creatures and nobody's got the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Anyway, that's how
Yep.
I came to
Beautiful.
bring it
Yeah, I
back.
love the visual that came to me. It was like it's a vessel, like just the standard clay pot, right? The water vessel, but it's actually sitting in some loose mud, and the rain is falling on it, but it's cracked, and so in the mud, some of the mud drifts in and pollutes the water. There's no real place for the water to go out unless something dips its hand in and pulls the crap out. So they're
If you look at the various religions of the world, I at least always find something to object to. I mean,
sure.
I find
Well,
beautiful things and truths, but it's not like every attitude. I think that the Old Testament say is definitely the work of a lot of people who had real spiritual experiences. I'm not going to deny that, but some of what they wrote down doesn't strike me as being the pure voice of wisdom and the enlightenment.
No, I think I agree. My take on that is that there's the transmission and then there's the translation. Something was transmitted, it then has to be unpacked and translated. Yours turned into the parable of the tribes and what we're up against. But the transmission was pure. The transmission was just the rainwater, and then the translation has to see it through the mud.
But even if it's imperfect, it's something we've got.
And it's something, even the imperfect shows the development of human consciousness and the fallacies and frailties that have been evolving over all this time of civilization.
The fact is the capacities, and only an important one, because you look at the history of humanity, and it's been an important one. The fact is, one of our capacities is evidence that it is real, is important. The distinction between the outside and the inside is, it's not merely subjective when a selective process in the world for what helps a creature survive in the world. The inside is a form of a projection of the nature of the world in which that proved advantageous.
Nice, yeah.
So,
feeling like wrapping up?
What's that?
Oh, go ahead, say something more.
It may be imperfect, but here we are, the creatures that took upon ourselves inadvertently some really enormous, difficult challenges to order our civilization soon enough and well enough so we can avoid self-destruction. And we need all the help we can get, and some things have been built up into us, which have been weakened by a secular worldview that doesn't respect and honor those dimensions because, for whatever reason, I mean, we talked before, you asked me, why did the secular worldview not conceive of the spiritual dimension in a more positive, respectful light? And I put forward a couple of ideas which may or may not give the scientific revolution and its prestige, and also the need to actually do some work to be able to conceptualize what the religious traditions conceptualize for people and embodied in figures and forces that once you get rid of the religious tradition, you still need a way to conceive of it. And so that's part of my Better Human story is, here's a way to conceive of it. You can get to, spirituality, the spiritual dimension is real, the moral dimension are real. You can get there in a way that's consistent with the scientific notion that you look at the evidence, you apply logic, you draw the right conclusions. And that's what I feel like I'm claiming that I've been doing.
So, and I'm someone who's read the work and thinks it's brilliant. So I don't have a pushback. I know that Sam Harris has been bombarded. Do you know who Sam Harris is?
I know the name, but I don't know where you're going in terms of content.
Just saying, no, just on the idea of value and how he gets pushed back on trying to say, well, wait a minute, it's really not okay for Muslims to think it's okay to destroy the infidels. He's just trying to use different examples of where religion has gone wrong and is in the way of human progress, and just took all kinds of crap, like online and stuff, for being oh, you're trying to be anti-Muslim, and he's like, you're missing my point. My point is,
well, he probably could do the same thing with Christianity and Islam and the Hindus in India. I mean, everybody's got ways of utilizing their religion in unattractive, unjust ways.
Yeah, So
And
there again, I hope that's
there's a
just transmission
contamination again.
versus translation, right? It's just a
Yeah.
contaminated translation based on the brokenness that is
So he,
created through
so
the
he,
invent of civilization.
when you talk about the pushback he's getting, you're not talking about pushback like I have gotten about values just a matter of opinion,
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah.
that too.
That, yeah.
He's a
Right on target with, you're being judgmental, like you were saying earlier
uh,
about judgment and judgmental, that,
right.
we have to be non-judgmental. And it's like, well, you can't throw out all judgment with the non-judgmental, accepting
What
everybody for who they are. You better realize who they really are first.
I think of it this way: that those, there is such a thing as the human face. We can talk about the human face, even though we know that 8 billion people on this planet, the identical twins, but there's just an enormous variety of human faces. But we can agree that there's such a thing as a human face, even if there were a few that just sort of don't even share the basics. It's still such a cluster, and this, um, I think that you can say that there is inborn within us um, certain tendencies of valuing positively versus negatively, experiencing some things as better and some things as worse, that we differ from one another in ways, just like we do with our faces. But there would be, if you were to, sort of create some kind of a staccato, whatever that is, like a graph where every individual is this little dot, there'd be a huge cluster around uh, certain evaluative tendencies that are born into us. Just like I know how to handle a kitten. I've known a lot of cats. I know how to make them feel good about their way they're being. Though every time I get to know a new cat, there are little peculiarities. Don't pet her there. Pet her like this. But still, I know how. And human beings are like that too. And if you define the human good, forget for the moment the good of all the other creatures on Earth, which I don't forget. But it's got to do with humans having experience in it being good to be alive among those creatures for whom it can be good or not good to feel the way they feel in the world. That goodness, the human fulfillment, the thriving is the good. That's built into what got selected for. It's built into how we have been structured to feel about things. And individuality, our own experiences, being part of different family cultures, being part of different law, they all can create these real variations on a theme. But there is, I think, a basic human value system that is born into human beings generally, even if you can only talk about it in sort of vague probabilistic ways.
Yeah, I have no ability to steel man or stand up for those who are trying to say value isn't real. I know that I think the roots of it must be in this, multiculturalism that arose, when industrial, you know, production allowed us to travel the world much easier, and we all had to come home and realize, well, those people ain't so bad. I always said bad things about the Italians, but now that I get over there, they're not so bad.
Well, we can also look at it historically a little bit. In the olden days of Christendom, when there was one church in the Western Europe, there was they enforced a lot of conformity, and so everybody was supposed to believe the same thing. Then there was a process of world exploration in which the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then the English and the French and the Dutch go around, and they discover that I mean, probably I knew it in some way, but it was much more of a confrontation of there are whole different civilizations that think about things really differently. It's not like there had been, no contact with the Arab world or something, but so little that uniformity was for a long time a way of coping uh, with the question of what's true.
And
And
or where do
people,
I fit in, right?
you fit in by conforming.
Right.
And so anthropology started growing out of this. You say cultural relativism. Some people took the attitude, like the Spanish conquistadors, that we're going to compel the Indians to give up their religions and become Catholics, even if, like in New Mexico, they cut off the foot of every male to do it.
Don't know that, but yeah.
Well, it's not pretty.
It's not a pretty story. Yeah.
No. So the question of how to deal with the idea that what we believe may not be the absolute truth, and to coexist in the same world as people who believe other things, and to find common ground, to hold one's beliefs in a different way. I think it's a cultural challenge, and particularly when people are broken. I
Yeah.
think that the uncertainty of saying, well, maybe I'm not so much righter than everybody else on the planet. I don't think that a lot of people are comfortable with that. They may have a need for certainty that make them like Alito. I'm guessing somehow not feeling able to give respect, which requires a certain degree of humility, which is the result of a certain degree of uncertainty, which is what intellectual honesty requires of all of us human beings. I don't think he can afford it, is my guess.
Yeah, I think that's where I think that sentence, encapsulates why it breaks down, because it is so challenging to have the intellectual openness and integrity to stand your own ground while entertaining the other, new idea or the new, pushback from someone else, and then to do it in a humble and wholesome way. That's a mastery of, that's a high human being who can handle that, degree of
been missing?
intelligent, gymnastics.
What's been missing in the response from the secular worldview in liberal America that it inhabits is the recognition that sometimes things arise that have to be dealt with, not with tolerance and exception. I mean, I've noticed in many places that people think that, this is a virtue. Not being judgmental is a virtue. Being tolerant is a virtue. Those are all virtues, except in situations where they're not.
Right.
And that requires, again, getting more complex. And so when you've got a destructive force taking over half of America, people who say, well, my friends across the aisle, not recognizing that sometimes you're facing something that simply is destructive. It is not interested in coming to terms and finding a good way to work together toward a better future. It wants to invade Poland in 1939 or Ukraine in 2022 or basically make the politics of a democratic nation into one of unrelenting conflict and a struggle for power without respect for the rules. If you have something like that, you don't deal with it with tolerance. You don't have humility because you can say that is wrong. What was going on in Germany in the 1930s needed to be defeated. Doesn't mean that FDR and Churchill ruled over perfect countries, but to them went the task. Just like in our times, to us goes the task. And it doesn't help us do that task if we don't even conceive of there being something like a coherent force that is consistently destructive and it spreads a pattern of brokenness and acts very much the way the religious traditions used to say evil did.
Absolutely. So our topic title had the word connecting. What's the secular way to connect?
Well, I don't have, like a meditation practice, there are lots of practices that people can, I've been initiated in agapa or whatever is some Tibetan form of back in the countercultural days in Berkeley. I've been inducted into TM, I know that there are a lot of traditions that offer a path, and I think there's value and potential for all of them.
Well, yoga and meditation is becoming something you can just go to the, store next to the CVS and get.
I've got my practices of a sort, but what I feel like I've got to offer anybody else isn't something like that. It's if you've not been thinking that the spiritual dimension is something that's real, important, and life-serving, I can show that that's the case. And so I think that conceptual mapping of, oh, there really is something inside me that I should look to. It has the implication of we should tune in on it as best we can. That's already a step. How you tune in on it? Well, I have a Methodist, he was a minister, now he's a bishop, and he's a wonderful man. And I know that he has practices of what he thinks is he's tuning in on God, letting God speak to him. That's not the way I conceive of it, but what do I know? And he uses the word discernment. There's some kind of a quiet place that he goes into, and some way of tuning in, without turning on or dropping out. And I think it works for him. I think his conduct in the world shows that he is guided by contact with something in the spiritual dimension, however that's to be conceived. And I suppose and my brother is a very spiritual guy, believes some things that I don't believe. And he's made himself of service to people in general and his family in particular, in a way which is, very much has all the, it's definitely a spiritual path of serving out of love. And I know he just looks at things that way. What can I do to be of service? Well, I heard of somebody presenting the ideas of Stoicism, that it's that you give yourself assignments of putting yourself in positions that are uncomfortable, that are challenging, so that when life deals you with something big that is challenging, you have learned how to respond with the wisdom of the Stoics. You're not destroyed by it. You're not knocked off your spiritual core. Because, like boot camp, teaches you to how to keep on going in spite of all these reasons you don't want to, because in battle, you're going to probably have that feeling a lot. There you are on the beach and they're throwing these mortars at you and they're machine gunning, you got to keep going. That's your job. Boot camp is intended to prepare you to do that. And I think there are a lot of ways that we can take ourselves to certain kinds of boot camp to develop our capacity to get to some place that we think is of spiritual value. I don't advertise myself as a particularly paragon of humanity. My wife, April over here, I can see all kinds of ways she's a better person than I am. I'm okay, but there are a lot of ways in which I'm just still, I think about the change what you can change, don't accept what you can't change, and have the wisdom to, I just realize there's, At the age of 78, I've probably done about what I can. And I fell short of the goal line, but I might be within field goal range.
Nice. Well, shall we close? Is there any other niggling ideas that want to make it out?
Not that I'm aware of. Is there some itch that you would like scratched?
I looked at the questions I wrote up. We have covered the ground that yeah, I think we've covered the ground. Yeah,
Let
standing,
me.
and that was a nice summation. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm just very grateful that you're here playing with me. There's something different that happens in conversation than in. I mean, I kind of like the monologue, but there was a way in which where we went was a co-creation. It was an improvisation. It was the water flowing as the water would. And that in itself, I think, is, well, I hope it's of value to those people who have been accompanying us in this conversation. And I'm very grateful to you for joining me, and I hope that we can explore something more in the future.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Forrest.
Andy.
That's Forrest Jones from North Carolina, speaking to Andy Schmuckler here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Bye-bye. That what should I do next? I have why is human sexuality beset by complications? Is that what should be next? I've got Hunter Biden's sacrificial role. I think I'd like to get topical. Um, I already talked about the Justice Alito thing, so I'm going to knock that off the menu. But I'm assuming that everybody knows that this week the son of the President of the United States was having a trial that I'm pretty sure began last week, and then it concluded, and the verdict came in from the jury that he was guilty on all those counts. And there's general agreement. Two things. One is that given the facts and given the law, the jury did its job right. It's supposed to apply the facts to the law, and it concluded that indeed Hunter Biden had violated the law. It is also generally acknowledged that if Hunter Biden had not been the son of the President of the United States, this whole thing would have been resolved in a very different, less of an ordeal kind of a way. There are different ways of looking at that, but anyway, these cases are seldom brought. So, and then the other element of this is this has happened at a particular moment in time, such that even though Hunter Biden's having to go through this ordeal, and we don't know how much more ordeal there's going to be, even though that's not really the best way things could have been if America were in ideal condition. Nonetheless, in that moment, this trial and his ordeal actually serve a valuable purpose and turn him from a victim as well as a criminal, and he's both of those by the letter of the law, but also turn him into a sacrifice, which is something that can have real value. So here's what I've written. This is not something that's I've regarded as ready for publication, but it'll do for now here. If I were Hunter Biden, I would see my path, my mistakes, my misfortunes, and my suffering as giving me a role that serves my nation. I would see that I'd turned out to be a useful sacrifice at a time of national crisis. My mistakes would be clear. My bad choices exposed me to the law. But it's also my misfortune because legal experts agree that cases like mine are virtually never brought to trial. My case came to trial because I am the son of the President of the United States, and because two aspects of my father's situation combined to condemn me to this fate. First, he stands in the way of Donald Trump's getting what he wants. And second, the rule of law is under attack like never before in this nation's history. And the rule of law is one of those things for which my father has the responsibilities of the presidency. As for the suffering, it has already been an ordeal, and even though the facts of my case wouldn't ordinarily lead to jail time, the same set of forces that led to the anomaly of my being tried might make my sentence likewise harsher than usual. Yet I would embrace my suffering as best I could, because I'd see myself as playing a sacrificial role that serves a meaningful, patriotic purpose. For a long while, it looked like I would just be a casualty of the way my father's Department of Justice continually bent over backwards to prove that it was restoring blind justice's rule of the law. No fear or favor, a restoration of the integrity that had been sacrificed by Trump's DOJ under William Barr, with his and Trump's targeting Trump's enemies and coming to the aid of Trump's accomplices. Bending over backwards, they kept in place the prosecutor Trump had appointed to go after me. And it was he who decided to bring to trial a case that almost never would be settled, that almost always would be settled more easily and discreetly. For a long while, it looked like my ordeal would achieve nothing, as has been the case with every other case of bending over backwards that this Attorney General has done, such as trying in both the January 6th case and the classified document case to avoid any confrontation with Trump over crimes he'd clearly committed. But by a stroke of great fortune, the timing of my ordeal, my in this case again being Hunter Biden, has made my case a valuable blow against the latest assault on the rule of law by Trump and the Trump party. The rule of law has functioned just as it's supposed to, and the jury did its job right. In my case, given the facts and the law, in convicting Trump of 34 felonies that were committed as part of a scheme to help him win the 2016 presidential election. Not a very good sentence. What I'm saying there is the jury did its job in both cases. In response, Trump and pretty much the whole Republican Party has been screaming about how this travesty of justice and how it's about the weaponization of the Department of Justice against this president's rival, even though the Department of Justice had nothing to do with the New York State trial, how the conviction of Trump marks a disgraceful day in the history of our nation. Lies. In this battle between the truth that the justice system functioned exactly as it should, And the lie that Merrick Garland and my father are using the law to go after the enemy, the opinion of the American people is the battlefield. The lie that told by Trump and his accomplices, that my father, President Joe Biden, has betrayed his oath of office and used the justice to wage political warfare for his own purposes, is directly refuted by my fate. My father could have appointed his own special prosecutor for my case, or intervened later to have the case dropped. But he didn't. My father, the president, could rescue me from the rule of law with a pardon, like Trump did for his accomplices like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and Mike Flynn. But he has declared that he will not do that. Trump and I both committed crimes and are being held accountable. One side of our politics accepts that, as my father demonstrates by behaving impeccably, even as he watches his only living son pay the price. One side accepts accountability and the rule of law. The other side of our politics sides with the criminal against the rule of law. My ordeal thus serves to expose the lie from Trump and the Trump party about the weaponization of justice. The American people, witnessing the integrity of my father's Department of Justice, can draw the proper conclusions about which side in the upcoming election represents the protection of America's basic values and which side represents its overthrow. Because of the timing of my trial and conviction, because that timing was perfect, it serves a I get to serve a sacrificial role. My trial and conviction came immediately on the heels of Trump's criminality being declared by a unanimous jury, and on the heels of the Trump party attacking the legitimacy of the American system of justice with accusation that my conviction disproves. And that's where it stops. And much of what I'm saying here is sort of implied or somewhat said in a variety of places. People have been saying, take a look at the refutation. Here's the president's son, and the president is not showing fear or favor. I do think that that accusation is so ludicrous because the actual defects in Merrick Garland's Department of Justice have been just the opposite. That they, if the crimes that were already well exposed to the whole public from Trump, and it would be suspected from a whole cadre of people who are meeting in the war room the night before the insurrection, if those had been investigated and pursued from the same moment as they pursued the identification, investigation, prosecution of the people who are actually pulling off this attack on Congress, all this would have been almost 2 years ahead of time. And we wouldn't be in the situation where it looks like this trial in Manhattan is the only one that's going to be conducted. Liz Cheney was right. It can't be that we see what we saw on January 6th and then we go to vote 4 years later and the public still hasn't seen a trial about the crimes that are involved with this attempt to overthrow an election. It can't be, but it is. And there are various reasons why it is. it wouldn't be this way if the Supreme Court hadn't become captured by something really the opposite of what the Supreme Court should be. The Supreme Court could easily have had the trial. What the circuit court said was, even if we had to go to the circuit court, was a perfect thing to just let the trial begin. And that was clearly the national interest. But the Supreme Court intervened to give Trump the delay that he wanted. So probably we'll never see that trial conducted before the election, and maybe never if Trump wins. But the other thing that is right there at the beginning there on the Department of Justice's side is that in order to demonstrate that he wasn't politicizing the Department of Justice, he politicized the Department of Justice and didn't treat the crimes from the top like he would if it wasn't if it was any other American citizen be committing those crimes. He bent over backwards, and that wasn't a good way to defend the rule of law. It forfeited with the help of the Supreme Court. It's allowed the criminal to really significantly defeat the rule of law, at least temporarily, and increases the chance that the criminal, and there's no reason to think that these other trials are less likely to result in a conviction than the one in Manhattan. In fact, I would say they are much more likely to than those appeared to be before the trials. But I think they're all very likely. He was Merrick Garland bent over backwards to be unpolitical, and he made a serious mistake of making a decision that was political, and it has political ramifications that the criminal is able to get to Election Day without some of the most serious crimes in American history being presented in a court of law where facts and truth always have the advantage, as opposed to our politics where the lie has been very successful. And where we've got a prodigious liar leading one of America's two main political parties and advertising quite openly that when he gets a hold of the powers of the presidency again, there's not going to be any pretense of or attempt to have independence of the judiciary. There are plans being drawn up that can be found, this Project 2025 or whatever it's called. This is going to be a weaponized Department of Justice. It's not the American system. It is the overthrow of the rule of law. And it's gotten advantages because, for one thing, this president and his attorney general, particularly the attorney general, have been so scrupulous about not committing any of this, not only not committing this kinds of sins that Bill Barr's Justice Department committed, but not giving anybody any basis whatever to believe that they had committed any of those sins of weaponization. And every time that liberal America has bent over backwards, it's just given an advantage to the forces that are attacking the rule of law. Barack Obama said he wasn't going to prosecute any of the crimes. And there were a few serious ones in the W presidency leading up to Obama's taking office, and swearing to see that the laws are faithfully upheld. But he says we're going to look backward and look forward instead of look backward. All prosecutions require looking backward. He didn't want people on the right who are so already by 2009 kind of rabid from thinking that he was doing something political as opposed to keeping his oath in office. So he betrayed his oath of office, Obama did in 2009, saying he wasn't going to make sure that the laws were faithfully enforced when there was evidence of crimes. And he got nothing for it. He didn't want the right wing to think that he was a bad guy. They end up thinking 20% of them think he's the Antichrist. Everything gets in order to avoid the right getting more and more angry and upset. Garland bends over backwards, not to and everybody else trying to get these documents back. For example, in Florida, they're not dealing with Trump the way any other citizen would have been dealt with. One expert after another says that any other American would be in jail if they did this at various points along the way. But eventually they have an FBI raid. Not raid, but they get a search warrant. Way late. And then and then we got another corrupt judge giving him the delays that he needs. You don't get rewarded for bending over backwards with an opponent like this. Garland was doing the opposite of what he's accused of, yet he's still accused of it. And most of the Republican base, I think, believes it. So there's nothing gained. Hunter Biden's prosecution, I think, was in danger, as I have it in this piece, of being just something that didn't get any attention. But because it comes at this very special moment when the Republican Party is making these blatant, disgraceful assaults on the rule of law, like no political party has ever done, even when they haven't liked the verdict, it's very timely. And if I were in his shoes, I would try to celebrate that, even though I'm sure it's no fun to go through what he's gone through. Okay. I want to say something about immigration. The liberal point of view on immigration tends to be much more celebratory, much more tolerant, much more compassionate than the attitude on the political right. And I think you can say that this has been true in many countries that have had to deal with substantial waves of immigration. Now, I come from the liberal side of political America. My grandparents were immigrants, and I haven't forgotten that. I like what the poet Emma Lazarus said at the foundation of the Statue of Liberty. I lit my lamp beside the golden door. I have had concerns about immigration in terms of overpopulation issues. I'm not sure what to think about that these years, but in general, I feel compassionate toward people who are walking long distances to cross the border into the United States illegally or to seek asylum. But there's one thing which, for me now, overrides my feelings about the value of opening up asylum to people who are in terrible straits. I remember boats being turned back of Jews in 1930, whatever, to have to go back to Germany where they would be killed in the death camps. That hurts to hear about. But there's something else that's become visible in our world, in country after country, and that is that there's a fact, and I'm not sure there's anything to be done about it, that if there's a lot of immigration, particularly of people who speak different languages or sort of harder to integrate culturally. I don't know what all the factors are, but it feeds the force of fascism in a lot of democracies these years. And we just saw that this past weekend with the EU's elections and the considerable gains of, like in France, of Marie Le Pen's National Unity Party, or whatever it's called. And we've seen it in even a country like Sweden that's had social democratic, very liberal governments for generations, now has a pretty right-wing government. And the Italians have had to deal with it, and they've got sort of a semi-fascist. All of them have in common that they tap into the anti-immigration feelings in the public. And Germany, little f, D, for Deutschland, the right-wing party, the anti-democratic immigration passion strengthens the right wing in all these countries. And I think that we probably should come to a conclusion, at least in this era, when the societies that are dealing with immigration are maybe particularly vulnerable on this. Maybe maybe it would have been okay in the 1950s or 60s to open the door. Maybe not. But at least right now, the bigger issue is what's bigger than the fate of people, even a lot of people who are fleeing terrible circumstances, may matter less than the preservation of the larger picture of liberal democratic values versus fascistic values. That the dangers of feeding popular support into so that fascistic parties prevail in elections is a more important danger to attend to than the danger that particular individuals might suffer, unfortunately, because the door isn't open more widely to rescue them. I don't know what the right policy would look like. But I think that those of us who are compassionate about these asylum seekers need to get a little bit tougher than we have recognized before about immigration policy. And you can see that the Biden administration has really sort of been scrambling for the last year to try to make itself less vulnerable to having people who are upset about immigration vote for Trump and the Trump party on the basis of our borders out of control. There's a lot of lies in that accusation, but there has been a problem. And as good liberals, the Democratic Party has been very slow to take into consideration. But the fact is, too many people have trouble with it. I mean, you could wish that they didn't. You could wish that everybody was compassionate and didn't find difference so bad and were more willing to extend themselves to integrate other people, and more willing to tolerate differences. You can wish that people were different. But if it goes from Sweden to Hungary, where Orban rode immigration to fascist power, and Brexit, and France and Germany and Italy, if all those countries have been struggling with this issue in a way that hurt the forces of liberal democracy and fortified the forces of fascism, I think it makes sense to do what the Biden administration has done. Maybe too late. They can keep on pointing how Trump refused to let the Republicans resolve the problem by accepting what Biden proposed, which is basically a Republican set of positions, things that were like a wish list for Republicans over the years about how to clamp down on immigration. But Trump wanted the political issue, and I guess the way it'll be fought out is how successful will the Biden campaign be in making sure that people who are upset about immigration will be upset that Trump was playing politics with it rather than that Biden was practicing maybe too long the liberal way of looking at immigration. Well, I think that, well, should I do more? Raise your hand if you want me to quit. I don't see any hands. Guy cheats. Okay, there's one thing left. Why is human sexuality beset by complications? You folks give me just a minute away from the camera. I'll be right back. I'm not going to quit. Thanks. Oh, again, I'm Smuckler, and I've been talking about a variety of things. And, they're all part of what I'm calling a better human story. Some of the things I talk about are really, just like commentary on what's on the headlines of the moment, like Justice Alito and Hunter Biden and Trump's trials and things like that. But they really, all of these things are sort of among the particulars of well, a lot of bigger things are unfolding, like connecting them first with the battle over whether the rule of law will survive in America. That in itself is, I think, the battle between democracy and fascism in the world is sort of a contemporary version of a much larger drama that I also was talking about earlier in the thing. But this here we go back out to the evolutionary perspective on us human beings. That in order to understand our situation in general, I say, it is really important to look at the implications of what I don't question the validity of some essentially Darwinian perspective on how life developed on this planet, and how in the process of all that, we're just one species that got shaped by that same kind of process, evolutionary process of the selection for things that can get their DNA into the future. And then Forrest and I earlier were talking about how we can learn that the moral and spiritual dimensions are real, important, and life-serving from looking at what got selected for, that our ancestors passed along to us, a blueprint that make us this way and that way. And because biological evolution, well, I won't go into that again. This is going to become an op-ed in, I think, or maybe it already was an op-ed in the newspapers. Check into that. But anyway, I've published this stuff on my weekly op-ed in this very in newspapers, and I also published it, I believe, on Daily Kos. Anyone following the news of our society and our times, or familiar with various historical cultures, should know that human sexuality, in addition to all the good it brings into people's lives, has been beset by social tensions, cultural taboos, and personal troubles. Why is that? Here are some pieces of an answer. Sex originated to achieve an indispensable task for all living things, perpetuating one's kind. Some organisms achieve that differently, but human beings are one of a large number of organisms, plants as well as animals, who reproduce sexually. The next generation of each of those species is created by combining 2 packets of DNA, each containing half a blueprint for that particular life form. Secondly, we humans are mammals whose reproductive strategy involves the young developing inside the body of the mother-to-be, then being born when they are sufficiently fully formed. Mammalian sexual reproduction, therefore, requires one of those 2 packets of DNA to get inside the body of a different mature animal in order to meet up with its counterpart packet of DNA. That requires behavior that is unique, because nowhere else in our human behavioral repertoire do different humans make the boundaries of their bodies overlap. A pregnancy does involve mixed boundaries, but neither the mother nor the growing child need to make any choice to create that situation. Pregnancy happens to the mother as a result of sex, and life just happens to the offspring. So neither requires motivation to get that merging to happen. To make mammals do something so unique, the motivational force behind sexual behavior has to be exceptionally powerful. The great power of that motivational force, crafted into our species, because that's what it took to perpetuate one's kind, that's what selection means that the task of managing that force will be challenging. Third point, more than with other mammals, we human beings have had reason to complicate sexuality. Complicate sexuality by putting it to additional important uses. We developed into creatures that had need for that reproductive sexual bond to carry a lot more freight for the sake of survival. We developed into a creature whose success in perpetuating its kind required that the young be given more support for a longer time than with our mammalian cousins. Bullet point number 1. Our babies are born premature compared, say, with newborn chimpanzees. That prematurity reflects an evolutionary compromise. As the size of our ancestors' brains tripled over several million years, the newborns had to be born less fully developed to enable the females to bear such big-brained offspring. A cost of our becoming more intelligent has been that mothers and children have been more vulnerable for longer and therefore have needed more protection. And more protection means you want the male to stick around. I guess I get to that soon. Next point. Then, after infancy, human children need many more years compared to other mammalian and primate young to emerge into full adulthood. Both of those factors create the need for the human young and their mothers to have an environment that is more reliably protective for longer. And a major way of meeting that need is for the fathers to remain in the picture, more committed to their mates and their children. One important way of keeping the father in the picture is fortifying the sexual connection between mother and father, which may explain why the human female is, why the human female is, I believe, unique in being sexually receptive throughout her cycle, not only, as with mammals generally, when conception is possible. The powerful motivation of sexuality becomes a force to keep fathers and mothers together, fortifying a bond that helps the family unit to remain stable enough for the young to flourish. The building of that bond was advanced by making human sexuality more complex, adding some important emotional elements. The connection that keeps the family adaptively intact goes beyond the basic animal fire of the sexual impulse by using things in the realm of love to make the bond stronger and longer lasting. We are not the only primates who can love, but I believe we're the only ones that have combined love with reproduction. This task of melding two different dimensions of sexuality, the ancient animal and the more newly human, has complicated human sexuality. Humans have to integrate that primitive dimension of human sexuality, the dimension we share with stallions and mares, with bulls and cows, which is the dimension of animal desire and passion. And we have to integrate that with a more recent dimension, making family connection more enduring, bringing in a heart-based set of emotions. Some psychologists have talked about the challenge of bringing heart and genitals together in a unified way of being in relationship. All these complications of human sexuality, with the changing requirements for the perpetuation of our species, are connected with humankind's most important distinguishing characteristic: culture. I think that needs to be emphasized. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about the implications of civilization, but the implications of civilization are an extension of the implications of culture. These are all consequences of our being the creatures who put culture at the center of our strategy for survival. It is the increasing use of culture that made the brains bigger, made bigger brains so valuable. Having more to learn rewards having better equipment for learning. And you may recall that the bigger brains meant that we had to have babies born premature and therefore needing more protection, just to remind you that other point. It is culture, too, by giving our young more to learn, that has made it advantageous for our young to stay longer in their formative stage prior to adulthood, because adulthood requires a longer training period. Thus, it is humankind's specialization in culture that required the development of a more multidimensional sexual bond to stabilize the family relationships to better protect our vulnerable offspring. Culture made sexuality conflict. Well, it was when culture took off into civilization that human sexuality became downright problematic. Civilization, which has itself been so problematic because to meet altogether new requirements for social survival, it has demanded the rechanneling of human energies, including that powerful motivation for sexuality, a force that for eons had been allowed to express itself relatively freely because it worked to perform the essential task of perpetuating our kind. But the problematic aspect of civilization is a whole nother story, which I don't go into here. And then I close with some reference to some other pieces that I've written about that deeper sexual bond. And you can find it on my website at betterhumanstory.org. A couple short and longer versions of The Sacred Space of Lovers. And anyone interested in more about how civilization has demanded the rechanneling of human energies can find other dimensions of that explored in Chapter 5 of that book. Chapter 5 being titled The Psychological Evolution of Civilized Man. And that book having the title The Peril of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution. And let me just show in closing a little bit more about what that book looks like. It really explains, so I think, the dilemma that we stumbled into as a species when we became the civilization creating species. That we unleashed a force there that is really at the heart of the challenge that we still face here in America and in human civilization generally. A destructive force that isn't a function of our nature, shows that we're better creatures than we've thought ourselves to be. And it shows that we have this force that we still need to bring under control, or we're really likely to destroy ourselves. And that's sort of the foundational idea of my Better Human Story. It's in that book, and I talked about it with Forrest. And then I also talk about the evolutionary perspective about we've got sources of strength and guidance within us that evolution also put into us that show the reality and the importance and the life-serving nature of both the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension. Because what's inside us is there because it helped our ancestors to get their DNA into the future. Evolution is the key to understanding our situation. But there's a lot of work left to be done to integrate these additional pieces into Darwin's basic insight. That's what my Better Human Story attempts to do. Thank you.